We're looking today at Mark Goodale's Justice Between the Devil and the Deep Blue Sea. He opens his assessment of the anthropology of justice with a classic moment in Malinowski's Crime and Custom in Savage Society. That is the suicide of Kim Ai, a young lad, as Malinowski refers to him, whose incestuous affair with his maternal cousin, that is, she's categorized according to Trobriand rules of exogamy as a sister, therefore covered by the incest taboo. So this had become a scandal, not when it was happening, but rather when her discarded lover, the say legally eligible candidate for her to marry her, had hurled public accusations of incest at and gravely insulted Kim Ai. Goodale highlights the ambiguity of justice in the boy's suicide. So the boy, after being insulted publicly and having this scandal erupt around his incestuous relationship, donned festive garments, climbed to the top of a palm tree, shouted out his farewell to his clanspeople, and then and a veiled insult at the discarded lover, and threw himself to his death. Right. So Goodale then highlights the ambiguity of justice in the boy's suicide. So his declarations before he leapt committed his kinsman, to a vendetta against his defamer. But further, the community's flexibility with respect to exogamy, right, that it had tolerated this relationship as it tolerates other similar relationships that transgress the rule of exogamy, the demand that one marry and engage in sexual relations only with those outside one's clan. But Malinowski points out that the community is actually flexible in everyday life with respect to this rule. And so the affair had persisted until the suitor's public accusation made their tacit acceptance impossible to maintain. This required Kim Ai's punishment, which he undertook himself, throwing himself from the tree. So then Goodale's point is that had the suitor remained silent, this could have persisted and everyone would have been okay with it. Does that suggest then that there are informal rules of everyday tolerance that the suitor violated, right? So not the sort of regulations around exogamy, but the everyday understandings of what is acceptable and what will be tolerated. Beyond pointing to the complexity of assessing justice in a specific ethnographic case, Goodale cites Malinowski to highlight a widespread feature of the anthropology of justice, the approach to justice from an emic perspective. Okay, so what does that mean? According to anthroencyclopedia.com, this is formerly, I think, Cambridge University Open Access Anthropology Encyclopedia. In any case, they say that imported from linguistics into anthropology in the 1960s, EDIC came to stand for ambitions to establish an objective scientific approach to the study of culture, whereas emic refers to the goal of grasping the world according to one's interlocutor's particular points of view. So this is what Goodale is pointing to with Malinowski, is this effort to grasp the world as it appears from the point of view, and justice in particular, as it appears from the point of view of the Trobriand Islanders in Malinowski's case, but of course it can apply to any community. So in this, Goodale sees a willingness among anthropologists that persists today. A disciplinary pattern, he says, in anthropology that takes seriously the diversity of ways through which societies accommodate their own moments of fracture, social suffering, and repair. He traces this pattern in 4 developments, and this is what we'll devote most of our attention to here, right after I improve the lighting. First, he calls the banality of justice. He starts then with ethnographies of international justice, projects like international tribunals, addressing atrocities to prosecute individuals who engaged in prolonged or extensive violence in specific countries. And so Yugoslavia and Rwanda in the 1990s are examples that he raises, and the ways that international tribunals arose to address the violence in each of those cases. This research charts on the one side the contradictory practices of petitioners, litigants, bureaucrats, lawyers, victims, witnesses, the accused, judges, third parties, right? Not all of whom are going to have the same agenda, the same goals for prosecution, and so will stand sometimes in contradictory relationships to one another. On the other hand, though, it notes how political silences and manipulations, fictions, disenchantment limit the promise of justice beyond the nation state. And so this is not a case that he describes, but you could see as an example Augusto Pinochet, who launched a coup in Chile in the 1970s and then ruled as a military ruler, a dictator for decades after that, engaging in, or rather having members of the military and police engage in all sorts of atrocities, like simply disappearing people. He was called before the International Criminal Court, and for a long time managed to defer his presence there, citing health concerns, because he was quite old at the time, right? So that there is a way then that these international bodies can still leave people disenchanted or disappointed. Also, as he points out, there are ways that the international bodies are prone to politicization in a way that will prioritize certain politics and impose silence on others. And so his first case then is that this is an area that anthropologists have studied. In this body of research, he says 3 themes stand out. The threat of prosecution, for example, by the ICC, he says, amounts to a judicialization of international politics, think of Pinochet here, that leads to unintended consequences, sometimes on the side of justice and sometimes not. Secondly, the reliance of international courts on legally defined identities of victims and claimants can be at odds with lived identities, right? So that, again, this is not a case that he takes up here, though he describes it a little bit below. One of the ways that courts will position people will be in legal terms, sometimes, for example, as victim. If you take the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, following the fall of the apartheid regime, One of the things that arose with it is that there were some people who came to testify to the commission who were presented as victims, who had to package their testimony in terms of victimage, whose words were then reproduced in various media as victims. And yet some of them wanted to make the case, well, no, I'm not a victim, or not simply a victim. I was a freedom fighter. And that is clearly a different kind of sense of who one is and how one positions oneself. So then the legally defined identities can be constraining in ways that don't sit well with everyone. But also, as Goodale points out, this means that the kinds of categories that they employ are not culture neutral, that they are culturally biased in particular ways. The third point, then, or the third theme, is that international justice offers anthropologists the opportunity to reflect on debates over key anthropological concepts like culture, religious identity, neocolonialism, and legal pluralism. Right? So how is it that investigations into these kinds of institutions raises questions or allows for a different kind of consideration of these sort of staple concepts of anthropology? He notes a kind of a bleak possibility in international justice to which many anthropologists point. He says, within its broader context, a set of liberalist logics determine which understandings of justice will, quote unquote, thrive and which will not. In this way, quote unquote, justice loses its grand connotations and abstracted associations with emancipation and with making broken societies whole again. Suggesting again, then, that the fact of these institutions and the concepts they employ not being culturally neutral can lead to these kinds of problems of sort of conceptual constraints. Next, we get to bare justice. So in the 1990s, anthropologists produced studies on processes of nation building, national reconciliation, and collective reckoning with past atrocities, especially as they were embodied in truth and reconciliation commissions like the South African one I was just mentioning, also called TRCs. So once again, ambitious campaigns to address past wrongs. So let me be clear. The anthropologists writing about these sorts of institutions are not saying that they were constructed in cynical ways, that the people's intentions were in the right place, let's say. But good intentions don't guarantee good outcomes. So that, again, okay, these ambitious campaigns to address past wrongs and in attempts to allow for a better future sometimes came at the expense of justice. And the South African TRC is an example that there were, in some instances, the TRC worked at cross purposes with local forms of justice grounded in vengeance, thereby reducing legal pluralism and, he says, creating a gap between the centralized state as the sole arbiter of justice and local communities that had their own views on how to attain justice. But another aspect of this, then, is that the commission was designed to pursue truth and reconciliation. And so they would give legal amnesty to perpetrators of violence during the apartheid regime who testified, who publicly acknowledged their role in the maintenance of a patently unjust system. That's possibly a route toward reconciliation, but you can also see how it sacrifices justice in order to achieve that kind of reconciliation. He also points to a distinct strategy that appeared in Rwanda, which had taken note of the disappointments with the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So there, a local dispute resolution mechanism called Gacaca was fashioned to respond to mass violence, or refashioned, I should say. So it produced, though, its own disappointments. He says, eventually evolving into a mechanism for the consolidation of Tutsi state power. So Tutsi and Hutu were the two main ethnic groups involved in genocidal violence in Rwanda. Okay, so but the Tutsi had come out as the sort of the dominant power in the state. This for a whole host of historical reasons having to do with British colonialism. I won't get into them. The point is simply that this model, Gacaca, had the possibility of allowing a, so to speak, a locally recognizable dispute mechanism to work to achieve something like reconciliation, to allow a certain kind of a set of future possibilities to emerge, but it got then diverted to consolidate Tutsi state power. He says then, through a series of procedural steps and normative erasures that were focused as much on revenge as on the development of an innovative platform for transitional justice. So that in 2008, for example, the law changed the official statement on the 1994 violence from genocide and massacres, right, a fairly broad, inclusive kind of statement, to genocide against the Tutsis. This meant that reconciliation would become much more difficult as Hutu victims of violence were then excluded from engaging in national mourning activities. It clearly positions Hutus as perpetrators of violence, Tutsis as victims, and it embeds that legally in the state, so that, again, the idea may be that justice would be elusive, come what may, if reconciliation is the goal, but it certainly makes a particular kind of imagining of a future together more difficult. So then in both South Africa and Rwanda, reconciliation seemed to crowd out justice, and in such a way that reconciliation has also remained difficult to attain in both cases. Third, we turn to injustice and citizen security. Goodale proposes calling this trend in anthropology the anthropology of injustice rather than the anthropology of justice, because it focuses on spaces of violence, insecurity, and citizen resistance in conditions of political and economic marginalization and rapid social change. He cites as an example Daniel Goldstein's work in Cochabamba, Bolivia, and he says his is perhaps the most well-developed anthropological analyses of the ways in which abstracted discourses of legal equality and human rights intertwine with various forms of insecurity to produce a context in which the performances of violence become a mode of both cultural expression and resistance to state incapacity. This kind of analysis, then, in anthropology, brings into view the ways that citizens can simultaneously be subject to the constraints of the law and yet live outside its protections, so that the state, far from providing security, perpetuates insecurity while at the same time establishing some form of order. Fourth, then, he turns to justice in the politics of representation. In this final section, Goodale explores how anthropologists have examined what he calls the multiplicity of justice as a site of public representation that crystallizes conflict, grounds new forms of resistance, and often stands in for the assertion of power within a broader politics. These are the contexts in which anthropologists study justice in its most malleable forms: legal, moral, discursive. In these studies, then, justice may be less an entity of some kind than it is a template that allows for inclusions and exclusions, transparency and deception, empowerment and denial. So again, one of the things that he's pointing towards here is the way that anthropological work doesn't show any particular mechanism or template of justice as having just one kind of an outcome, that the kinds of outcomes can be multiple and not determined in advance, so that the anthropological work then is to describe how these particular templates or concepts or mechanisms of justice actually function within a particular setting. The anthropology of justice in these kinds of studies reveals how debates over the relationship between justice and politics may rest on assumptions that don't actually hold up to anthropological scrutiny. The studies reveal instead that there are subtler interdependencies and points of contest, and how struggles about abstract concepts of fairness, the rule of law, and equity, or the imposition of will and interestedness were markers of more basic contests about the categories and mechanisms of public representation in transitions from trauma to social repair. So that contests like these can produce tensions between multiple and contradictory memory projects, right? So when he takes the example of Ronald Neeson's work on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada, one of the things that Neeson points to, that Goodale in turn points to, is how different groups of people with respect to the displacement of, displacement is the wrong word, the removal of Native Canadians into schools sometimes quite distant from their home, the absolute prohibition on using their native languages, forcing them to use English or French, how the people involved historically in that initiative will have different memory projects, different things that they want to recall about that, given their different placement. So that there may very well be many Indigenous Canadians who have a particular sense of the traumatic effect that this had in their lives and in the lives of their ancestors. Whereas there may be others who were involved in running these schools who perhaps did not have the sort of malevolent intentions that the schools have become associated with, and whose memory projects, therefore, are involved in maintaining other aspects of these schools that are not so well represented in the testimonies of those who suffered at them. And this then can bring out the ways that different collectivities will have different divergent goals and different priorities from these kinds of institutions and offering this kind of testimony. In Sierra Leone, for example, the formula proposed by David Crane, who was the previous chief prosecutor of the Special Court for Sierra Leone, his formula that truth plus justice equals sustainable peace glosses over the conundrum that, as in the South African TRC, sometimes the choice is not truth and justice. Sometimes the choice is truth or justice, which leaves justice elusive, with all of the corresponding disappointments that entails. Such tensions, then, as I was saying, are also visible in Canada's TRC. So then, Nietzsche found that the ambiguous relationship between the normative claims of justice and the politics that grounds them creates spaces that can be both socially formative and socially constructive at the same time. What results from this dynamic interaction is not simply new political and legal resources that might or might not prove useful to survivors of historical traumas, but rather what results are new ways of being and belonging in the world that transcend their origins. Right, so that there's then a productive potential in these as well. Productive not in the sense that, or not simply in the sense that something good has come out of them, but rather that they've produced something, and that something that they've produced can be these new ways of being and belonging. Sometimes they can appear as new ways of identifying oneself, production of new identities. In any case, whether these new ways of being and belonging can compensate for the harms arising from, in this case, the residential schools that I was just talking about, into which Indigenous Canadians were forced and within which they experienced ongoing abuse, that's an open question. But Goodale cites Nietzsche considering the possibility that the performance as testifiers, for example, of new identities that arise through testimony at the TRC can fill the space needed to understand the actual dynamics of residential institutions, the motives behind their establishment, the causes behind the corruption of their goals, and the qualities they might have in common with other more contemporary forms of misguided power and opinion. We're just going to pretend that I got the image of Goodale and the speech box on this slide. All right, moving on. So his conclusion. He wraps this up by raising 4 areas in which anthropology has studied the emergence of ideas of justice. First, in the context of human rights practices. Here, justice is the aspiration of human rights. Yet, justice can take on a life of its own. It can extend beyond human rights documents and indeed human rights mechanisms themselves as particular struggles unfold. Second, justice and the cultural. Anthropological literature identifies the cultural as a distinct source of ideas about justice, right? So the idea then that justice emerges within specific social contexts. But there's a hidden threat with this, and he advises that we must remain alert to the possibility that legal procedures that are attended to this can essentialize cultures as the producers of these different concepts of justice. So that the embedding of practices in communities, families, or neighborhoods allows us to recognize distinct sources for ideas about justice without having to commit ourselves to these ossified pictures of those communities, right? So that the threat then is that we think of communities or neighborhoods or families, the producers of ideas of justice, as having this kind of fixed, singular worldview, fixed, singular view of justice that can't change over time, that is not actually riven with internal conflict within that community, things like that. This is the essentializing danger that Goodale points to. Third, religion and justice. Religions, he says, typically have doctrines or concepts linked to justice. And though they may differ from one another, that we find that even in the midst of violent conflicts, to quote him, religion often serves as the basis for incipient conceptions of justice that are intertwined with cultural ideas about retribution, reconciliation, and recompense. Fourth, justice and practices of cosmopolitanism. Here we can see that transnational justice as thinking and feeling beyond the nation, right? So not containing one's thoughts and sensibilities about justice within the framework of the nation, but thinking transnationally, remains a moral motivation for action, right? That this is something that that motivates particular groups to action, whether that's institutionalized in something like the UN, or if it's in the kinds of emerging networks formed between far-flung indigenous movements that share an ideology of kind of pan-regional identity and shared experiences of historical suffering. And if that's the basis for their transnational cosmopolitan movements. In sum, Goodale has explored the anthropology of justice as it appears in The Rise and Possible Fall of International Criminal Law since World War II, TRCs and the problem of state-sanctioned violence as a form of politics by other means, anthropologists' problematizations of justice and as discourse and as practice in the face of structural violence, chronic poverty, and institutional racism, or, as he says, the anthropology of injustice. Fourth, anthropological studies of justice processes as forms of public representation, intervention, and collective self-making, as in the case of the Canadian TRC. And he concludes by proposing 4 associations through which anthropologists have studied justice. They are human rights, religion, the cultural, and cosmopolitanism. And that's it. Thank you for tuning in.